Hey guys, Palsteron here, and today let's go over the Balance Manifesto Part 1, where we talk about flasks and ailment mitigation. Now, I don't want to go through all of this. I wrote up some bullet points. I think this is actually really interesting and a huge positive update for the game. And I'm sure most of you guys know that flasks and ailment mitigation were some of the biggest points of contention in 3.15. In total, so it also makes sense to put them next to each other because flasks were also involved in ailment mitigation, so they kind of go hand in hand, right? Very interesting stuff here. We'll go over all of it without having to actually go through them yourself. Maybe it helps out some of you. I don't mind reading all of this, but I know a lot of people do, so I put up some bullet points and let's go through them. So my first bullet point here is ailments as the new resistances. What do I mean by that? Well, after finishing this whole manifesto here, the first thought that came to mind here is, oh, they want to make ailments into the new resistances, right? So let me explain real quick. So usually when you make a character, it is a given to cap your resistances. It's too easy not to, even if for some reason it would be hard. You would still do it because it's just such a defensive upside. So many things do elemental damage in this game. It's just a no-brainer at this point, right? But what if, for example, instead of every suffix having, on any gear piece, having like 40 res, they only had like 10 res, right? It would be a lot harder. So maybe there would be some builds that wouldn't cap their resistances for some reason, or people would have to get more creative on how to cap their resistances. So what I mean by that is this whole ailment rework seems to me that they want to make it so easy to cap that everybody is just going to include ailment avoidance in basically every build. And I say that because obviously ailment avoidance, while being very strong, is nowhere near as important as capping your resistance. A character with 0 resistances or minus 60 resistances is obviously not as strong as a character that has ailment avoidance. You're just going to get one shot by everything, right? So what I mean by that is they kind of have to make it so easy for you to get ailment avoidance from gear or whatever, that it's actually worth it. Because if you think about it before, the cost wasn't very much. You would have like 1 or 2 flask suffixes here or there, and you're done. Or you have like 1 prefix on your boots that cost you like 1x for the craft, right? And you're done. Most people in softcore didn't even go for ignite, any sort of ignite resistance or avoidance or whatever, or shock. You only cared about freeze and chill, right? Because they made you slower or they made you unable to move. Some builds had to go for stun, but they are really putting a lot of options on the table here, which I honestly find very exciting. I gotta say, because this is just another variable that can make your build better or worse. Like resistances, how you manage them can make your build good or bad. You can get them from the right sources or from the wrong sources. You can min-max your build. So the same is here. If you can somehow figure out the best way to get ailment immune from your gear, that will give you an advantage in build making. So I think this is a insanely good change. I love it. Now, next point is purity of elements got changed. So let's talk about this real quick, because purity of elements used to be used in some builds, right? If you don't have any good auras, it's actually on the table because sometimes you just don't get any resistances, right? So you either have to get it from jewels, which means you can get less crit multi because the all res is also a suffix, right? So a purity of elements could indirectly give you basically like crit multi, like 50% crit multi or something that you wouldn't have otherwise because you don't have to get them on jewels or whatever, which is really nice, right? But they completely reworked it here, and I'm actually very excited about this. Now, the new purity of elements basically gives you elemental ailment immunity straight up. So obviously it's not as huge as it used to be because all of these changes, you can get it easier, but not having to worry about it at all is absolutely huge for some builds. And let me tell you right now that, for example, Strength Stacker or Int Stackers have a really hard time giving up suffixes on gear because that's where they get their int or their strength from. The thing that they're starved for is suffixes. And what's also in the suffix? Res. So Purity of Elements is actually in a very interesting spot for those kind of builds, but also for some other builds. How often do you make a build and you're like, I don't really have a main aura, right? Obviously, if you're completely fizz scaling or like impale or whatever, Pride is a no-brainer, right? If you're a mage and you need the wrath, right? Sometimes you need the anger, but if you're fire build, sometimes anger doesn't actually do that much, especially when you're like fizz to fire conversion. And in those kind of builds, if you think about it, there's not that much competition. There's like Herald of Ash or whatever. So we can already see that some builds just do not have a main aura. And I say that because while they gave you this, they also made it so it now reserves 50%. Now, if I'm not sure how good a certain aura is in my build, I usually do something that I call the alls test. Now, what I mean by alls test is sometimes you just have to think about how good an aura is in the sense that you can get it for free on an alls uprising. So if you look at what the alls gives you plus the aura, you can kind of determine whether that aura might be legit on some builds because you can just run alls, right? So it's still interesting to know your options here. So if you have alls here, you have the life, right? Which is part 1 of a good Emmy. You have a decent implicit, all attributes is always fine. You get some int, which is okay. For some builds, it's really, really good. Energy shield can be good. Crit most of the time is good. And then you have purity of elements has no reservation. So we can basically add whatever purity does onto this amulet. And that would be 34 auras. Now that is 2 times, like a little bit better than 2 times of what you would normally get on an all-res roll on an amulet, right? So you get 34 auras, even 35 on level 21. And then you're completely ailment immune. So what this also gives you is you don't have to screw around with anything on your gear. You're just ailment immune. And I just want to stress how good that could be on just an alls, even if you have a main aura that you need to run, like Pride or Wrath or whatever. Also, something to take away here is that this says all elemental ailments. If you just stack, for example, chill immune, freeze immune, shock immune, ignite immune, that doesn't make you completely avoid elemental ailments because there's also Scourge, Brittle, and Sap in the game, which you will encounter, for example, in simulacrums. So that's also some small detail here. Overall, I would say Purity of Elements is in a very interesting spot, and I'm predicting it's going to be used quite a bit. And also something I want to point out here is that Purity of Elements, if this doesn't get adjusted, I'm just going to say, has crazy Watcher's Eye mods. So, for example, you get up to 50% Chaos Res while you have Purity of Elements. Also, the physical damage taken as mods are a little bit higher than on the Purity of Fire and Purity of Ice, which usually only go to 10. With Purity of Elements, they go to 12. So that might also play a role in how good Purity of Elements is. I'm just going to predict that most int or strength stackers are going to be very interested in that. And then some other builds who don't really need their amulet slot will be seriously thinking about the alls. Now, next up, Consecrated Ground got buffed. While you're on Consecrated Ground, it's now you now have 50% reduced effect of curses, which is very interesting for Inquisitors because they always have Consecrated Ground and it lingers under you. You can obviously also get it with a Zealotry Watcher's Eye, which is usually a big payoff because that means 1 less mod from a Watcher's Eye, which are pretty big. But yeah, overall, this is a very welcome change. Instead of making Consecrated Ground offensive, they want to make it more defensive, which definitely makes sense. New passive nodes, honestly, I went through them. They are basically saying that they want to give you passive nodes against conditional stuff like Maim, Hinder, Poison, or whatever. I don't think I would ever take these on the passive tree. Most builds are too tight, especially since Cluster Jewels are a thing, right? On passive points to ever go for that, it sounds a little bit too conditional is what I wrote down here. But we have to see how those actually play out. If it's like 1 point to get Maim immune or whatever, I mean, I'm taking it most of the time, right? But you can also just get that on, I guess, a Jewel implicit, so maybe not. I don't know. We don't know the full changes, but I'm not too excited about new passive nodes. Now, next up, pretty huge, the crafted Ailment Avoidance mods got buffed across the board. They're now a little bit better, for example, on chest armor, for example, on helmet or whatever. Pretty cool. Overall, it's going to make it easier. You probably can save 1 suffix somewhere and still get Ailment Avoidance to 100%. Cool change. I applaud it. Then also, one of the biggest changes, I think, is Harvest Implicits got buffed. So if you don't know, Harvest Implicits would basically give you 10% reduced effect of shock, or reduced ignite duration, or reduced effect of freeze, whatever, right? Reduced effect of chill, avoid chill, all of those things, always 10%, and they got buffed to 15%. Now, if you've ever played a Fulcrum build, for example, you would know that going from 10 to 15% is actually quite a huge deal. That means you don't have to farm Harvest as much for those implicits, which are basically free, right? Unless they're corrupted. So that's also a huge change, and honestly, min-maxing, if you have like 2 Cluster Jewel setups, and I don't know, like 5 to 6 jewels, you might just get complete ailment immunity just through your jewels. It would take a lot of time to actually farm that, but I don't know, you can do it if you want to. Now, next up, let's talk about flasks here. The most interesting thing that I'm so happy they kind of that they came to this conclusion is that they sort of talked about reactive versus aura-like flasks. Because the problem with how they wanted ailment avoidance to be is, for example, you would have to press an anti-ignite flask to remove the ignite, right? Which is kind of weird with flasks. You just press every 4 seconds, right? You don't want to reactively press your Quicksilver flask. You don't want to reactively press your damage flask, because at the point where you get ignited and you want to remove it, you might not need the damage, right? It's very, very weird dynamic. Also with life flasks, for example, sometimes you would just have to press it to get like your freeze off or your bleed off or whatever. So I'm very, very nice. It's very, very nice that they address this. They basically have new sort of mods for reactive flasks, like life flasks, where if you press it, you just get a certain duration, and that duration can be very long. And in general, they want to move away. They kind of just want to distinguish those two types of flask, which I think is going to be very, very important in making flask feel good again. Now, next up, they are actually reconsidering and moving back to the old immunity flasks, but they want to give it more of a downside. So basically, as you can see here, they want to bring back immunity to bleeding, corrupted blood, poison, shock, ignite, freeze. But there is a caveat to that. There is 35% less duration at the highest tier. I will just say right now that I don't know where exactly that is, but they are increasing the base duration across the board. So while this seems bad, it's actually not as bad. It basically comes out to almost having the old ailment immunity flasks back. So they kind of conceded that point with an interesting dynamic here, because this means that having these as suffixes on your flasks actually costs more. Also because they are introducing other new mods that are kind of damage related, or I don't know, for example, they rebuffed adrenaline from 8% to now it's, I think, 14% movement speed, where it gets playable again. 14% movement speed is very, very good. Very interesting. Might be worth picking that again. It's not the 30% we're used to, but still good. So I like that they kind of put a trade-off in there, and that they kind of conceded that point, because I think that was one of the most annoying parts about 3.15. And at the end, in the flask section, they also talk about how they want to make non-instant life flasks better. Now, I personally like that. I always liked bubbling flasks more than completely instant life flasks. So them basically giving life flasks that regenerate over time more power is very interesting. I'm not sure how it's going to work out, because in actuality, when you're playing the game, as you know, a lot of the time you need the life back fast. So I hope they make enough of a change that it actually does something, because I fear that most people are still going to include a instant life flask. And at the end here, in a short section, they talk about giving Ranger a new cluster that has to do with flasks, and somewhere in the Ranger starting area, but that cluster will also give you mana gain on hit, which is huge for a lot of Ranger builds, especially like tornado shot builds. Actually, a lot of these builds that hit a lot of attack speed have problems sustaining with just leech, especially because they are on the right side of the tree and they have like no mana. They have like 700 mana, so you can only regen 10% of that per second. Kind of weak, right? But with the mana gain on hit, that could actually just work out and fix all the mana problems, which is especially huge because they increased all the mana multipliers last patch. So that is very interesting to look out for. And also, they want to introduce, they didn't say exactly what they want to do, but they want to introduce jewels that change the way that you gain flask charges. I think this is very, very interesting, but could also be very dangerous, especially if it's going to be too easy to have flask uptime against bosses. Like, they basically want to say that on kill, that when you slot in these jewels, you're not going to gain flash charges on kill, but by some other way. So what that could be is just that bossers will slot that in whenever they're bossing, right? Just put in that jewel, and now you have better flask uptime against bosses, which could be a very tedious and annoying playstyle. So I don't know about this one. I hope they really thought about that, because that sounds pretty broken, potentially. But yeah, that's basically it for part 1 of the Balance Manifesto. Part 2 and part 3 are going to come out tomorrow and the day after, and we're obviously going to cover that as well. So overall, I hope I could give you some overview here. And yeah, very positive overall. I think that it's astonishing that they basically answered all the problems the community had, right? Or I had, at least, for sure. yeah, I don't really feel like it feels very good, especially how they go through it here, like problem solution specifics. It's very, very pragmatic. I'm very, very happy about that. But we got to see for part 2 and part 3. And yeah, but that's it for the video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't already, subscribe. As always, thank you to my Twitch subscribers and my Patreons. Thank you for supporting me. And if you want to check out my stream, go to twitch.tv/Palsteron. And we basically talk about anything there. Also we're going to definitely talk about this in detail. So yeah, since I still don't have a slogan, see you next time.